Imagine the stench. A miasma of unwashed bodies, animal musk, stale ale, and the lingering ghost of wood smoke clinging to the damp thatch. 10 souls crammed into a single suffocating space, a crucible of shared breath and stifled desires. A brutal intimacy, raw and inescapable. Now, forget the romanticized notions of medieval life. Forget chivalry and courtly love. This is the truth. Love, in its most primal form, survived in the dark, in the suffocating press of bodies, not because of, but in spite of, the utter lack of privacy. How? The medieval peasant's home, a term almost too grand for the reality, was less a dwelling and more a shared lung, breathing in the day's toil and exhaling the night's weary sighs. Think of a single oblong space constructed from whatever materials were cheapest and most readily available. Wattle and daub, rough-hewn timbers, or in colder climes, unforgiving stone. A fire pit dominated the centre, its smoke curling upwards towards a hole in the roof. A constant battle against the elements and the perpetual threat of asphyxiation. Around this meagre hearth huddled everyone. Parents, children, grandparents, perhaps an orphaned cousin or a weary servant, all vying for a sliver of warmth and a scrap of sustenance. And then, of course, there were the animals, chickens pecking at scraps on the earthen floor, a goat tethered near the hearth for warmth and milk, perhaps even a pig snuffling in the corner. This was not a home. It was a teeming microcosm of life, death, and everything in between, playing out under the constant scrutiny of every living thing within its walls. Privacy, as we understand it, simply did not exist. There were no bedrooms, no walls to retreat behind, no doors to slam shut against the world. The concept of personal space was a foreign luxury, an unimaginable indulgence. The bed, if it could even be called that, was a communal affair. A pile of straw laid upon the floor, or, if the family was slightly more fortunate, upon a rudimentary wooden frame. Coarse wool blankets, scratchy and thin, offered minimal protection against the biting cold. Pillows were a rarity, and any semblance of separation was purely imaginary. The day bled seamlessly into the night. The table where meals were eaten became the bed where bodies sought solace. Children slept nestled against their parents, sharing their warmth and their dreams. In winter, survival demanded proximity, a desperate huddle against the encroaching cold. This was the landscape of medieval marriage, a landscape devoid of solitude, where love was forced to bloom in the most unlikely and inhospitable of conditions. The question isn't how love flourished, but how it endured. How did desire navigate the labyrinth of shared space and constant observation? Where did intimacy find refuge in a world where every touch, every sigh was a public performance? Marriage in this context was not a private contract between two individuals. It was a social and economic alliance, a binding agreement witnessed and often regulated by the community. The wedding vows were spoken in public, and the celebration was a communal affair. Even the consummation of the marriage was often subject to scrutiny, with ceremonial bedding customs requiring witnesses to ensure the union was fulfilled. For most couples, the wedding night offered no respite, no privacy. Instead, it was merely the beginning of a lifetime lived in the constant presence of others. Imagine the sheer audacity of desire in such an environment, the yearning for connection, the primal urge to touch and be touched, forced to contend with the ever-present reality of shared space and the watchful eyes of family and neighbours. Court records from the period offer glimpses into the desperate measures couples took to find even a fleeting moment of intimacy. A wife accused of lying with her husband behind the bread oven because her family home offered no other sanctuary. A servant overhearing her master and mistress each night, separated only by a thin hanging cloth. The constant negotiation, the unspoken agreements, the desperate attempts to carve out a space for themselves in a world that offered none. The Church, with its rigid doctrines and unwavering moral pronouncements, added another layer of complexity to the already fraught landscape of medieval intimacy. Sexual relations within marriage were permitted, even encouraged, but only for the purpose of procreation. Any hint of pleasure or desire beyond the intent to conceive was viewed with suspicion, even branded as sinful. Confession manuals from the 13th century instructed priests to question couples about their intimate encounters, probing for any signs of excessive fondness or wanton words, exchanged within earshot of others. Guilt was measured not only by actions, but also by the context in which they occurred. The law reinforced these moral strictures with fornication, adultery, and even unseemly behaviour subject to the scrutiny of ecclesiastical courts. Neighbours and servants were often called upon to testify, their accounts of overheard whispers, creaking floorboards, and stifled laughter used as evidence of wrongdoing. The medieval home, with its thin walls and permeable boundaries, became a panopticon of sorts, where every action was potentially observed, judged, and condemned. In this environment, intimacy was not a private matter. It was a public performance, subject to the constant gaze of the community and the ever-watchful eye of the Church. So, how did they do it? How did couples navigate the treacherous terrain of shared space and societal scrutiny to find moments of genuine connection? The answer lies in a combination of ingenuity, adaptation, and a profound understanding of the subtle rhythms of daily life. When physical barriers were impossible, they created their own, using the tools and resources available to them. Fabric, surprisingly, became a crucial element in the quest for privacy. While timber and stone were often scarce, fabric, even of the crudest sort, could offer a semblance of separation. These weren't the delicate silks and velvets of the wealthy. They were thick woolen cloths, often patched and worn, strung across beams or nailed into rafters to create makeshift partitions. They didn't block out sound, but they offered a visual barrier, a suggestion of enclosure that could make all the difference. For couples, even a thin curtain could represent a sanctuary, a place to undress in relative privacy, to speak softly without fear of being overheard, to reach out and touch without a dozen eyes staring. By the 15th century, wealthier peasants began to list bed curtains in their household inventories, alongside cooking pots and tools, a testament to the growing value placed on privacy, even if it remained a rare and precious commodity. The Forester bed, with its heavy drapes on all sides, became a status symbol, a room within a room, a haven of warmth and intimacy. But for most families, such luxuries were unattainable. They made do with less. A curtain hung over a corner, a blanket pinned to a beam, a screen of bundled reeds. The goal wasn't to completely isolate themselves from the world, but to create a subtle boundary, a visual cue that signaled a desire for privacy. These makeshift partitions weren't about blocking out others. They were about holding in something of their own, creating a space where intimacy could tentatively blossom. In a world where space was shared, privacy became an act of invention, a creative response to the limitations of their environment. And yet, even the most ingenious makeshift barrier could only offer so much protection. Sound still travelled easily through the thin walls and open spaces. Whispers could be overheard, and moans could betray even the most carefully concealed encounter. Couples had to develop a new language, a language of silence and subtle gestures, to communicate their desires and intentions without alerting the rest of the household. Intimacy in the medieval home was rarely spontaneous. It was carefully planned and strategically executed. Couples learned to read the rhythm of the room, to anticipate the ebb and flow of activity. They waited for the baby to fall asleep, for the neighbour to leave for market, for the fire to die down, and the footsteps outside to fade into the night. Silence became a tool, a language in itself, a promise of shared intimacy. Words were risky, but a glance, a shared look at dusk, could be enough to signal readiness or caution. Small signs, carefully placed, could convey volumes without uttering a single word. A turned-up shoe, a lantern placed in a certain spot, could indicate availability or warn of potential interruption. In households with servants, one partner might feign illness to send them away on an errand, creating a temporary window of opportunity. Others waited for household tasks to scatter the family, sending them off to fetch water, tend animals, or collect kindling, creating brief moments of solitude. In regions with outbuildings, barns, bakehouses, and store huts offered the possibility of short, clandestine escapes. These weren't romantic getaways. They were stolen moments, carved from the noise and motion of daily life, a desperate attempt to find a space where they could be alone, even if only for a few precious minutes. Timing was everything. In winter, the long nights offered a distinct advantage. Darkness fell early, and the house quieted sooner. People slept longer, and in that slow descent into cold and stillness, couples could find their narrow window of opportunity. The absence of light provided a cloak of anonymity, a temporary reprieve from the constant scrutiny of the day. No doors, no locks, but still, somehow, a flicker of privacy survived, just long enough to ignite a spark of intimacy. Consider the sheer ingenuity required to orchestrate these moments, the careful planning, the unspoken communication, the constant awareness of the surrounding environment. It was a delicate dance, a precarious balancing act between desire and necessity, between the longing for connection and the ever-present threat of exposure. And yet, despite the challenges, couples persevered, finding ways to express their love and desire in the most unlikely of circumstances. In essence, they became masters of improvisation, adapting to the limitations of their environment and finding creative solutions to the problem of privacy. They learned to communicate without words, to signal their intentions with subtle gestures, to read the rhythms of the room and seize fleeting moments of opportunity. They transformed silence into a language of shared secrets and unspoken promises, a language that allowed them to connect on a deeper level, even in the midst of the chaos and congestion of medieval life. Of course, the ability to find intimacy in the medieval world was not equally distributed. Class played a significant role, shaping the landscape of love and desire in profound ways. For the poor, the one-room house was the only world they knew, a constant reminder of their limited resources and their lack of privacy. There were no spare chambers to retreat to, no separate beds to call their own, no choices to be made. Privacy was a fantasy, an unattainable luxury. But for the wealthier members of society, the minor lords, the merchants, the prosperous yeomen, privacy became a marker of status, a tangible symbol of their elevated position. By the late medieval period, some homes began to include a solar, an upper room reserved for sleeping away from the main hall. This was a significant development, offering a level of privacy previously unheard of. The lord and lady could retreat to their solar, behind a door that could be closed and even locked, providing a sanctuary from the noise and bustle of the household. The solar often included a chimney, allowing for a fire to be lit in the bedroom, creating a warm and comfortable space for intimate encounters. For the first time, perhaps, love could unfold without the constant presence of witnesses. Inventories from the 14th century Kent document the contents of these separate bedchambers, listing curtains, linen sheets, and even small chests for personal items, a clear indication of the growing importance placed on privacy and comfort. The stark contrast between the solar and the one-room house highlights the vast disparities in living conditions that existed in medieval society. While the wealthy enjoyed the luxury of privacy, the cotter and the villein still slept by the hearth, beside the cradle, under a thatched roof, their lives circumscribed by the limitations of their poverty. Even within the confines of religious institutions where intimacy was strictly forbidden, the human desire for connection found ways to express itself. Hidden corners and confessionals became clandestine meeting places, silent witnesses to whispered confessions and stolen moments. Monasteries and nunneries, despite their vows of chastity and seclusion, were not immune to the pull of human desire. Walls, even those built to separate the spiritual from the carnal, could not always contain the yearnings of the heart. Even in castles, where nobles had their own rooms, walls were thin and servants listened. Gossip travelled quickly through the corridors and courtyards, and so privacy was never absolute, even for the most powerful members of society. Intimacy, in the medieval world, was not a binary concept. It was a spectrum, a continuum that ranged from the complete lack of privacy experienced by the poor to the relative seclusion enjoyed by the wealthy. It was scaled, shaped, and bought, a commodity that could be acquired through wealth and status. A fire could warm a chamber, but only wealth could silence the rest of the house. But what happened when even curtains and separate rooms failed to provide adequate privacy? What recourse did couples have when their homes were too full, too loud, too narrow to accommodate their desires? The answer often was to leave the house altogether. Many couples, especially those who were young or unmarried, sought privacy where no one lived, in barns, bakehouses, or the edge of the forest. These were not romantic locations. They were places where the cold bit hard and the shadows held unknown dangers, but they offered something that the crowded communal home could not: the illusion of solitude, the possibility of being alone, even if only for a brief time. Church records speak of sin committed near the stables or fleshly acts behind the mill wall. These weren't tales of unrestrained revelry. They were desperate attempts to find a space for intimacy, the only options left to those who had no other recourse. In some villages, guards who patrolled at night caught lovers in fields, under trees, behind hedges. Punishment followed, in the form of fines, whippings, and public shaming. Yet the behaviour continued, a testament to the enduring power of human desire, even in the face of societal condemnation. For married couples, these clandestine encounters weren't always about illicit pleasure. They were often about survival, about finding a way to connect in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart. If a home was too full, too loud, too narrow, then love had to travel, even if that meant braving the mud and hay, or the bitter wind of early spring. One 15th century record from Norfolk tells of a couple who lay together on a sack of wheat behind the granary door while the house was filled with guests. The details are stark and unromantic, and yet quietly heroic, because in a world built against privacy, every act of closeness was an act of defiance, a refusal to be denied the fundamental human need for connection. These moments, stolen from the margins of society, were not about escaping the constraints of their lives. They were about reaffirming their humanity, about finding a space for love to flourish in the most unlikely of circumstances. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest and most crowded of times, the desire for intimacy can find a way to break through. Medieval intimacy was never just a private matter. It was a social construct, regulated, observed, and judged by the community. The Church, as we've seen, played a significant role in shaping attitudes towards sex and marriage, emphasizing procreation above all else and viewing any deviation from this norm with suspicion. Desire without the intent to conceive was considered suspect, and even excessive fondness between spouses could be deemed sinful. Confession manuals instructed priests to probe for any signs of immoderate affection, any hint of pleasure that strayed beyond the bounds of marital duty. The law reinforced these moral strictures, with ecclesiastical courts empowered to prosecute fornication, adultery, and other forms of unseemly behaviour. These courts relied heavily on the testimony of neighbours and servants, turning the medieval home into a potential source of evidence against those who transgressed societal norms. In one Norwich record from 1442, a neighbour testified that a couple were joined after dark while her mother snored. In another, a maid described the boards creaking and laughter behind the cloth. Homes had thin walls, floors creaked, and people listened. Sometimes it was malice, sometimes curiosity, but always someone knew or suspected. And so intimacy was never just between two. It was a quiet rebellion against judgment, against shame, against the ever-present ear pressed to the timber wall. But in the end, the night offered something rare, something precious, not privacy, but mercy. When the candles burned out, when voices faded into sleep, when the cold settled in and the dark pressed close, then the world, for a brief moment, forgot. There, in the silence, couples found slivers of tenderness, fleeting moments of connection that transcended the limitations of their environment. A hand slipped into another's, a breath warmed against a neck, words whispered so softly that even the mice beneath the straw couldn't hear. No one saw, no one judged. Not the priest, not the children, not even God, perhaps. These weren't grand passions, but small mercies, moments that made the struggle worth bearing. A husband kissed his wife's fingers as frost gathered on the window. A mother reached across the straw to where her partner lay, just to know he was still there. There, in that hush, love endured, not with fire, not with poetry, but with patience and stillness. And the darkness, for once, kept its promise to cover, not condemn. Privacy didn't arrive overnight. It crept in like heat through a long, cold wall. By the late 16th century, change was visible in blueprints. In wealthier households, the one-room structure gave way to separate chambers, a hall for guests, a kitchen for work, a bedroom for sleep, and sometimes even a second room called the withdrawing room, meant to pull away from company. Architecture began to reflect intimacy. Walls were built not just for shelter, but for silence. In towns, multi-story homes emerged, sleeping areas moved upstairs, fireplaces were added to bedrooms, shutters thickened, doors began to lock. For the poor, change came slower. Rural homes remained crowded, but even there, small steps appeared. Fabric partitions, corner beds, wooden screens, chimneys reduced smoke. Brick replaced wattle and daub. Glass, once rare, began to close the open window. And as privacy became structure, intimacy found a new place to breathe, without shame, without witness, without interruption. A shift not just in space, but in what love was allowed to be. So, how did couples find intimacy in one-room homes? They didn't wait for space, they made it. They carved out privacy with curtains, with glances, with the rhythm of daily life. They held hands behind woven mats, whispered under blankets, loved without doors or distance. And somehow, despite the cold, the noise, the constant nearness of others, they loved deeply, quietly, persistently. Not because they had privacy, but because they needed each other more than they needed comfort. Love didn't thrive in those homes because the conditions were ideal. It survived because two people chose to see only each other, even with the world closing in around them. And maybe, in some ways, that's what made it last. So, the next time you close your bedroom door, or turn on soft music, or dim the light just enough, remember them, the ones who had none of it, and still found a way. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of things too sacred to speak aloud. When we look back at those one-room homes, dark, crowded, cold, we shouldn't see poverty. We should see people making space for each other when there was no space to give. A touch when no one could look. A breath when the walls pressed in. A promise spoken without words. In our world today, we can close a door, we can switch off a light, but too often we close the heart as well. Those couples long gone knew a different way. They loved not despite discomfort, but through it. And maybe that's the kind of love that survives longest. Not loud, not grand, just quiet and constant. Two people holding on to each other, even when the world gives them nothing. World gives them nothing. World